welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Marin Sullivan, and we're going to talk about sculpture and architecture. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Sullivan is a lecturer in the history of art and architecture at DePaul University, and her book, which came out this year, is titled Alloys, American Sculpture and Architecture at Mid-Century. And I understand that you're providing an alternate history of mid-century American art in this context. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so my background in training is as a specialist in modern and contemporary sculpture.
Yeah.
And when I was kind of starting this book project, it hit me that it's really painting that garners the most attention in the post-war period in terms of American art history.
Yeah.
And so I started kind of looking at sculptural projects and who was active as a sculptor kind of in the immediate post-war years, so the 40s and 50s primarily. And what struck me is that there are a number of artists who start to work in a really collaborative way with architects. So they're doing commissioned pieces, so not something that they're doing kind of in the privacy of their own studio or motivated by their own, modes of expression, but work that they really want to be seen by the general public that will have a wider audience. And this kind of runs counter narrative to what is really the standard narrative in art history, which is formalism, art for art's sake. It's about the genius of the individual artist.
Yeah,
So,
the independent artist who doesn't compromise with anyone. Right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
And in fact, the book opens up with a story about Mark Rothko pulling out a series of murals that he does for the Four Seasons restaurant in New York because he doesn't want people drinking martinis, in front of his paintings.
Really?
So there's this kind of idea of, art should be seen in galleries. It shouldn't be out in the world, and it definitely shouldn't have a function to it. And so I became really interested in, well, who are these artists and why are they interested in working collaboratively? And this kind of matched up really interestingly with the history of mid-century modern architecture,
Yeah.
which is also going through really, really big changes in the post-war period, kind of this second wave of modernist architects who are becoming increasingly interested in decoration and moving away from those really hard-edged, kind of clean boxes that we oftentimes think of with modernist architecture.
And this isn't really inconsistent with what's going on in painting, because you've also got Andy Warhol and
Yeah, exactly. So that kind of
artists
coming into the later 60s moment.
Yeah.
And so, there's this really big conversation going on in the post-war period amongst architecture, in architecture and design, that's around integration is the term that
Yeah.
really gets used a lot.
Yeah.
And I'm a little bit suspicious of this term of integration because it's not really one thing becoming a next or becoming something
You're
else.
describing it as collaborative, right? Which
It's
is different.
collaborative,
Yeah.
but yet architecture and sculpture are really keeping their own kind of specificities to them, even though they're coming together
Yeah.
on these projects. So I ended up using this term of synergy, which comes out of Buckminster Fuller, and this idea that, two things, this is where the title alloys comes in,
Yeah.
right? When you have an alloy, it can be copper and tin, but that alloy is still made up of copper and tin, even though it's becoming something different. So I
Yeah.
kind of use this as a framework to think about projects where sculpture and architecture come together, work really, really closely, take on the same type of material and formal means, and yet still maintain their own separate agendas in some ways.
Now, this style that we think of as mid-century modern, this trend, I've been described as simple lines, right, and honest use of materials. So the iron building is supposed to rust and look rusty, and we keep it simple. The Van der Rohe buildings and things like that. And so, is there something parallel about that that goes on with the sculptures, or is that part of the collaborative effort? In other words, were these two movements, coming along parallel and then joined one another, or?
Yeah. I mean, I think at first glance, you would actually think of kind of modernist architecture because it really eschews any extraneous decoration, right? It should be what it is. It is we oftentimes think of it as being very clean, simple, beautiful, very high quality materials with nothing extra, right? That less is more mentality that comes out of Mies. And yet, it's those exact kind of that second generation of modernist architects like Eero Saarinen, Gordon Bunshaft, Minoru Yamasaki, who actually start to become really, really interested in what we might call kind of decorative flourishes.
Yeah.
And those are the exact architects that are consistently turning to sculptors to create work for their buildings.
Yeah.
So it's kind of this moment when, again, architects are becoming really interested in sculpture, and sculptors are becoming really interested in the scale of architecture. And those two disciplines have always shared a lot, right? You share space and volume and industrial materials, and that becomes even more amplified in the post-war period when you have a whole range of sculptors that are now working with things like stainless steels, and they're welding, and they're using the exact same materials that the architects are doing. So
Calder being the main example.
Exactly.
Of this, right?
So Calder is, one of the core kind of case studies of the book, along with Harry Bertoya, Isamu Noguchi, and Richard Lippold, who's probably the least known of the four. And I think what became really interesting to me is, those four kind of primary case studies, or the people that figure heavily in the book, kind of were self-determined in a way, because those are the artists that are really getting, the kind of top-notch commissions over and over again. So it was kind of like looking back at the historical record and going, okay, well, who's getting these projects? And it was really those four consistently. So Bertoya, for example, works with Yamasaki on like 18 projects over the course of 2 decades. So they really are the kind of go-to people that they use. And I think what becomes really interesting to me about that is all four of those artists, especially when we're thinking of Noguchi or Calder, who are now, the kind of big name artists from the 20th century, they all had their backgrounds or training in design and engineering.
They also worked with jewelry.
Yes.
I noticed,
Yeah, so they all kind of come from like design, deck arts, functional objects, engineering. They're makers, and they're interested in craft, and they're interested in materials. So it's no coincidence to me that it's those artists who are the same artists that architects are coming to and being like, can you handle making a 50-foot screen for my building at the General Motors Technical Center? So, there's that material resonance again.
So. Historically, maybe, 50, 75 years before this, there was this debate about utilitarian art and art for art's sake, right? So the arts for art's sake people seem to have won that argument. But this group is going against that, aren't they? They're saying that we want our art to serve a utilitarian purpose. I think,
absolutely. Right? And I mean, this is definitely something when we're looking at the histories of modernism, this idea of should art play a useful function in society is something that modern art kind of steadily moves the conversation away from. And I think that's, again, what becomes the standard of narrative. It gets kind of, it becomes dogma with the writings of a critic like Clement Greenberg in the 20th century. But I think that that's a really kind of gross oversimplification of what's going on in the visual arts, because there's always artists, thinking back to like the Soviet constructivists in the early 20th century, there's always artists who want their work to have a useful function to it.
And we have a history of murals in with architecture, right? Which
and even if we think about like...
Goes back to ancient Greece and Rome, right?
Yeah, and the history of architecture really has it wasn't until the modern period when art was actually kind of divorced or detached from architecture. If we think of Gothic cathedrals across Europe, they're full of sculpture and stained glass and murals. So I think that was really that interest in that reintegration in the post-war period. They were looking back to the Renaissance and to the Gothic and saying, how could art again play a role in everyday life? And that's, I think, something that still feels really resonant and important today, when art still feels a little bit detached from everyday life. And these artists in the immediate post-war period were really invested in kind of the everyday person walking into the space and having a sculpture change how they saw that space and experienced that space.
Yeah, it's interesting because you go through a museum and you're looking at Picasso's Blue Guitar Player, and you get to the Van Gogh, and they're very different pieces, probably originally put in very different types of rooms, different environments, different interior styles when they were painted. And we just line them all up next to one another in a museum. But if you're one of these sculptors working with an architect, you're actually controlling the environment around your artwork, right?
Completely, and I think it is
Yeah.
something that, like, even if someone's walking through that space and they're not stopping and staring at it like they would in a museum, it's still kind of seeping into someone's mindset, right? And I think for these artists, and specifically because they are being commissioned and they're working very closely with the architects, it's very different from, I think, today. You know, you walk down any big lobby and there's just an artwork that's kind of plopped down in it, and it seems completely detached, and no one seems to care about it, and it's maybe there because there's now a percentage for art that has to be used for certain buildings.
Right.
But these were actual collaborations where the artist was thinking about the exact space to create work. And so, you know, an example that I discuss in the book is a work, .125, that it's also known as Flight, that Calder did for the JFK arrivals. And it's, you know, it hangs. It's a massive.
This is the terminal in New York.
Yes, and it's still there, though it's been relocated. But originally, it was made for this big cavernous space.
And they moved it?
And they moved it. This happens, unfortunately, a lot with
Which
these
just
pieces.
defeats the purpose of everything we're talking about here, right?
Exactly. You know, it hurts the architecture and it hurts the work if it was made for a particular space. But these works actually changed. Like, they were structural, they became a part of the architecture. They're not just kind of plopped down. They hung from ceilings, they became walls. You know, they connected spaces in ways that, quite frankly, a painting or a mural or a textile never could. It's something that's very unique to sculpture, being able to kind of take on an architectural language and scale.
So in some ways, is this a reaction to the stark plainness of modernism, and it's an attempt to kind of re-embrace the architectural, the more elaborate elements in architectural history? So where does this start? What are some of the first examples?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, you know, we can go back through the entirety history of art and see examples. But for the phenomenon that I'm looking at, the specific phenomenon, in the mid-century moment, one of the earliest examples I talk about in the book is another Calder work that was done for the Terrace Plaza Hotel in Cincinnati. And this was the kind of first modernist structure that was built in the United States following the end of the war. It's in the late 40s. And it's a really fascinating case study because the lobby of the hotel was on the 8th floor, so there was retail below. It was designed by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, and SOM, and Calder, and there was not just Calder, but there was a huge mural up in the restaurant, a huge art program.
And Calder was friends with Miro.
Exactly.
It was an influence on him, if I understand.
Completely. Right? They were very, very close.
Is this coincidental that these are here together? Or
well, again, I think they're already kind of established as artists who'd be open to working with architects. Both Miro and Calder, of course, very famously create work for the World's Fair.
So Calder had something there.
Calder created a kind of amazing fountain structure for the same pavilion. And so they definitely have a track record. And I think the art world is still a really small place, but particularly in the post-war period, it's a really, really small world. So people know each other, and kind of just how it is today. I don't think we always like to acknowledge this, but we want to work with our friends, right? We want to work with people that we know we're going to get good quality work out of. And so I think that's also, there's a social element. So Bertoia, another huge figure of the book, which is really where my interest in this topic comes from. You know, Bertoia starts his career at Cranbrook in Michigan, and it's at Cranbrook that he meets Florence Knoll and Eero Saarinen, and those become his closest colleagues and friends that he collaborates with on many of these projects. So it's through, again, those connections that a lot of these projects come to be. Now,
early at the beginning of this period here, are the architects designing their buildings and then looking for artwork to go in them, or are they looking at the artwork first, and is that influencing the design of the architecture?
Yeah, I mean, I think every project's a little bit different, right? There's no kind of template that anybody is using, and I think the best cases, so the most successful kind of collaborations between sculpture and architecture happen when the architect brings in the sculptor pretty early on in the process. And one of the examples that I can think of, which is actually very close to us, is Richard Lippold is commissioned to do a piece for the lobby of the Inland Steel Building in downtown Chicago. And of course, this is a really, really important new skyscraper that screams steel on every level. Again, another SOM building.
Right. City of big shoulders.
Exactly.
It's been screaming steel for a long
right,
time.
and it's part of this big, it's this huge kind of downtown revitalization and really making Chicago become this post-war modern city. And Richard Lippold is commissioned to do this really beautiful, it still stands exactly where it was made for in the lobby of Inland
that's
Steel.
good. I'm relieved.
It's still there. It's a beautiful, beautiful work. And it's a kind of radiating steel, looks almost like an asterisk. So it's used with wire, which is what Lippold becomes known for in these kind of steel rods. And it's in a very kind of shallow reflecting pool. So it's like glass and water and steel, and it just shimmers in the entirety of the lobby. And when they were making the lobby space, and this is still today, there's like a little retail space next to the lobby of Inland Steel. And Lippold comes up with the design, and he's showing the architects, and he's showing Lee Block, who is the VP of Inland Steel at the time. And the architect on the project, Bruce Graham, is like, we need more space for this sculpture. It's too cramped in here. So they actually have this beautiful like black granite wall, and they move the entirety of the wall and bring in a special lighting designer to better accommodate the sculpture. Right? And it's a mutually beneficial arrangement because the lobby looks better. This is a big kind of PR piece. You literally see it as you're walking down the outside streets. You see it from the street. So you want this lobby to look as good as it can. And so the architects and the sculptors and the lighting designers and the clients are all working together to think what's going to make this piece look the best. But that comes at that's like a literal like economic cost, right? It makes that retail space become a little bit less in terms of square footage. And that you see, again, I think with the architects who are the most kind of accommodating, the most collaborative, they'll change their design. They'll work around the artwork. It's really a conversation instead of, again, just something being plopped down.
They're fitting the artwork into it. They're making some adjustments in the interior. And mostly you're talking about interior, right? You're not talking about like the Picasso sitting out in front of.
Absolutely. So I think traditionally, if this work has ever been talked about, and I would say by and large, this is a whole kind of history of American sculpture that has never been discussed. If anything, it gets discussed kind of in architectural history, but usually just with an illustration. And I think that there's been this tendency to just kind of lump it in with public art. And it's actually functioning very, very differently from the public art that we see in the later 60s and 70s that are outside in plazas, like the Chicago Picasso. These are all
the Chagall.
Exactly, the Chagall, the Calder outside, the Flamingo. These pieces that I'm discussing in the book, again, they're all in kind of interior threshold spaces, and they really are being utilized within the structural specificities of the architecture itself.
So they are meeting one another halfway a lot
Absolutely.
of times, right?
And we should.
It's just that we're talking about interior space, not necessarily the shape of the outside of the building.
And we should definitely not kid ourselves. I mean, the architect and the architecture is definitely top dog in this situation, right? The artwork is never going to be as important as the entirety of the structure. But I think that the architects realize that there is a value add with art, and art done really thoughtfully and in a way that actually is in direct conversation, right? That synergizes with their architecture.
Well, in the history of Chicago architecture, we have Louis Sullivan, who not only designed the building, but designed all of the the artwork that was, or the patterns that would be on the stone and things like that, and Frank Lloyd Wright designing the stained glass windows and the furniture that would be in the room, right? So that was something that has been considered by architects historically, but we got away from it and then came back to it in a different way, right? We came back to it in a collaborative
Absolutely.
kind of way,
and I think, like, unlike somebody, like Wright, who is just thinking, I can do all of this myself, and he does it and does it pretty well. But I think that there's this idea.
Not very durably, but.
And so I think, what we see in the post-war period is like everybody playing to their strengths, right? So I think the architects at this moment are like, you know what, I actually can't make this 50-foot long welded steel screen. I'm going to bring in somebody who can really bring something to the table. So
now your book actually breaks this down in terms of walls and ceilings and things like that. Tell me how that works.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, I was really fortunate. Princeton University Press published the book and did a beautiful job at the design of it, but I really wanted this book to have a broader appeal. So it is, I think, very thoroughly researched and noted, but also I wanted it to be interesting just to anybody who might be, a mid-century modern enthusiast or somebody who's interested in the histories of American architecture and sculpture. And I think for me, what became most interesting is this kind of question around functionality and structure. So the book is actually laid out, there is a kind of overview, a historical kind of context that grounds the reader in the dialogues that were taking place, big projects that were taking place. But the main bodies of the chapters are really about walls, so sculptures that function as walls, that function as ceilings, and then the kind of latter, the substantive chapter is about what I'm calling the space in between. And in this case, these are sculptures that literally suture ceiling to floor. So they activate the entirety of an interior space. And that's something that's, again, very, very unique to sculpture, right? And unlike architecture, it's not just a post or a beam. It's doing something really, really unique. So I wanted to kind of bring in, again, this idea of like, well, how is this sculpture actually functioning in this space? What is it doing? How do these things kind of work as chandeliers, or in the case of Noguchi, a literal ceiling? He's making a literal ceiling. So that's how the book is separated. And then it kind of concludes by thinking about, well, what has happened, in the 50, 60 years plus since these projects have occurred. We are now at a moment when mid-century modern architecture is under really great threat. A lot of these structures aren't landmarked, and interiors especially are not landmarked. And so it really thinks about preservation and why we do or should care about these projects.
Are there some examples that are threatened right now in the Chicago area, the
Yeah,
Midwest?
Unfortunately, well, we have like a really good and a really bad example. So the really good example in my mind is like the Richard Lippold. It's beautifully taken care of. It's pretty much exactly as it was in inland steel. The only kind of modification is that there is now a kind of garish Frank Gehry desk across from it. But other than that, really? the actual structure is exactly as it was. I think the more kind of tragic example, and this isn't something I really talk about too much in the book because it is an outdoor piece, but there was a really lovely, incredible commission that Harry Bertoia did with Gordon Bunshaft for the Standard Oil building, Big Stan, in 1974, and it was an outdoor piece of his tonal kind of musical sculptures. And this is a project that has been, there's 6 examples of it right in front of the Aon Center today, but it has been kind of steadily dismantled decade by decade. So
Why?
It was originally, because everybody wants to like update plazas and do something new and go with different trends, and people own these properties, and so they can modify them. And so now it's kind of a tragic shell of what it once was.
Paris has been very good at preserving these things.
But I mean, like you think of these big cities. And even like a place like New York, for example, another project that I talk about in the book by Richard Lippold was a really incredible 120-foot long piece that he did called Orpheus and Apollo for Philharmonic Hall at Lincoln Center. And you think, oh, Lincoln Center, that's like one of the most important architectural complexes of the mid-20th century. It should be landmarked. It's not landmarked.
Really?
So Lincoln Center as a whole complex has had massive changes done to it, and including a very quiet removal of the Lippold piece from Lincoln Center. And so these things kind of, if they're not landmarked, if there's not regulation in place, these are things that can be removed, again, I think to the detriment of not only the artwork, but also the architecture.
Yeah. Well, so people that are in range of this broadcast, mostly Chicago area, where are some places you would tell them to go to see examples of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely the top case is the Inland Steel Building. So that would be the best example that you could see of this specific phenomenon. But also Chicago is a wonderful art and architecture city, so both in terms of modernism and modern art. I don't talk about the kind of later 60s moments, but, just walking kind of down Dearborn, you hit like, the Calder Flamingo, you hit the Chicago Picasso, the Inland Steel Richard Lippold, the Marc Chagall, and then the Bertoia is just around the corner. So you kind of have
a nice little tour.
It's a really great tour. Take people from out of town. It's like a wonderful, easy. There's great resources available on all of those works, and it's a lovely little walk to see some of the most important works of modern sculpture of the 20th century.
And just as we're getting to the end here, when we transition out of this period, how did this influence the period that comes after it?
Yeah, I think like this book project for me ended up kind of becoming like this lost history of American sculpture in a lot of ways.
Yeah, this little gap in the middle here, right?
It's
that we
an
haven't paid much
absolute
attention
gap.
to.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
everybody pays attention to kind of pop art and minimalism that comes later in the
Yeah.
60s, and then in architecture, postmodernism that comes later in the 20th century. But this particular moment, the first 20 years after the end of the Second World War, I think for me is actually the most foundational kind of moment in American art and architecture, because it kind of opens the floodgate for the conversations and projects that you see architects becoming sculptors and sculptors becoming
because
architects.
the buildings start to look like the sculpture.
Exactly,
as you get into
and
the
sculpture
late
becomes
20th
architecture,
century.
right?
Yeah.
You have installations, you have these big projects you can now walk through, that you can inhabit, and so we tend to think of that as being part of minimalism in the late 60s, this idea of environments. I actually think it's taking place much earlier in the immediate post-war period with projects like this.
Yeah, and this is a good place to see these things, right? I mean, what are some other cities that stand out for you?
Yeah, I mean, the book really kind of encompasses projects across the country. Definitely Midwest has a great representation in terms of modernism. So Cincinnati, St. Louis, fantastic.
I was surprised that Cincinnati turned up on
I
the
know,
list.
right?
Yeah.
You don't, and actually to think that Cincinnati had the more modern hotel before New York did in 1948. So that's definitely something to look at. But yeah, Houston, Dallas, New York, St. Louis, these are projects that were happening all across the United States.
And if someone has your book, they'll have a nice reference to be able to find these things, I would assume.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's all the time we have. I'd like to thank Dr. Marin Sullivan for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. I'll see you next time.